Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Metz gives us this analysis that in the privatized culture, because you have the rise of science, that science gives you a sense where we can dominate things, we can control. We can work experiments to figure out what to do, and then we can set up technology, and we can bend nature to our own will. And so and what Metz thinks is that that becomes a part of our mode of interacting with one another.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father James Cryan, who is pastor of St. Pius X Catholic Church in Toledo. Father Bacik and Father Cryan will discuss privatism in our culture, insights from relationships. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Jim, it's good to have you on the program here because I want to talk a little theology. It seems when I'm interested in talking about major theologians, your name comes to mind, and I'd love to have you on the program. And part of it is because you do have a good broad sense of the world of theology, and also I like the way you're able to relate it to current events. I think that's something you and I share, is the desire at least to figure out how theology can make a difference in pastoral practice in the life of real people today. That's part of my own interest, is always not in theology as a speculative discipline, but from a pastoral notion. It's interesting to me that a lot of the 20th century theologians did come at it that way. The great Karl Barth did his theology because he didn't think he knew how to preach to his working class parish anymore, and that he had to find a way to do that more effectively. And one of our leading guides, Karl Rahner, said that the more scientific theology is, the more practical and pastoral it will be, the more it will help us with our spiritual growth. So I want to come at it that way and talk about a particular theologian by the name of Johann Baptist Metz, a German theologian who's still alive, great disciple of Rahner, and one who's written some very difficult books, but also some simple, smaller books, Poverty of Spirit being one example of that. And I want to slant the discussion, Jim, to the question of privatism and the way it affects our own self-understanding and the way it affects our personal relationships. So let's, can we go along that line a bit? Privatism and self-understanding.
One of the issues that comes up, say, this is the year for human rights. All these concerts going on across the world for human rights. One can only have an empathy with the human rights issue if one interprets oneself in bonding with others. It's a marvelous thing. I don't know how far that goes, if it's just campy to have a concert in the name of human rights. To me, it's a bit embarrassing to have marvelous songs in honor of people who are being, have their fingernails torn out in Guatemala. But nevertheless, it is kind of part of the consciousness of a social being. One of the healthy things I think is happening recently in the East is this perestroika, the reshuffling of society, and recently the reshuffling of the Soviet cabinet, acknowledging the faults of the past, the faults of one's own party, a certain sense of repentance, even there, for as socialistic as they call themselves, hardly socialistic at all, so private, that they have made this monolithic society of all of a sudden saying, no, that kind of entrenchment has to be done over because it's only made us so private we can't relate to the free world. Marvelous examples here, I think, of some nations overcoming that sense of privatism. One of the big challenges is the privatism of the powerful nations trying to organize the whole world, which is kind of a privatistic thing, rather than say, I bond with you, rather, I will tell you what to do or how you should help yourself.
There's a couple ideas I'd like to pick up in there, because I guess we usually think of the Marxist systems, like we would find in Soviet Russia, as really creating a collectivist mentality about human existence rather than a privatism. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Well, for instance, you take the Nationalist Socialism of Germany in the 40s was hardly socialistic at all. It was anti-social or it was sociopathic. In the name of socialism, there was no bonding with other people. It was only dominance, fascism. When I think,
in other words, the key point you're making there is that the problem with that collectivist mentality, or we get in Marxism or got in Nazism, was that the pattern of relationship was domination,
yes,
rather than some sort of mutual and non-competitive relationship.
And therefore, it's alienating, to use a Marxist term, it's alienating as any capitalist country. In fact, if there was just two forms of dominance. Principally because there was no nucleus they could identify which would hold all peoples together. Certainly not capital. That was not the nucleus. Christianity, of course, believes the heart of Christ holds all society together, whether it's Christian society or not, by the way. Likewise, too, if you find in the experience of, I like Michael Harrington, a socialist in New York, who teaches at Queens,
who's dying of cancer.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, he's a marvelous man. But it's marvelous to know that, say, a lot of the work for the homeless in New York, a lot of the work for victims of just social, I don't want to say injustice. It is a form of injustice, but just the neglected, the
social alienation.
People on the periphery of society and don't know how to get back in. That his raising the conscience, be aware of these people. We're not telling you have to go out and save them. Don't throw money at them necessarily. But the question is, how do you relate to them? The question has to be asked. It's a frightening question. It's better to shove $100 in some man's hand and say, "Go away, don't bother me," than to say, "How am I supposed to relate to you?" And those are very difficult questions.
It certainly is. Speaking of Michael Harrington, in his famous book, The Other America, where he unmasked for us the question of poverty, and that's very much plays into this privatism idea, because it was the idea that the elderly and the poor were sort of shunted aside. They were no longer a member of the community. The word that's become common these days is marginalized. They were put on the margins and were no longer part of the larger community. And I think those people felt, and still feel, the homeless and so on, estranged to a tremendous degree, alienated from rooting and bondedness and connectedness that usually makes us feel good about ourselves, because then we sense that we belong. So we certainly see that at a social level in the United States as well as in the Marxist countries. You know, I was thinking, someone who's recently back from Prague was telling me about that sense of isolation he felt there, again, in a collectivist society which had this other kind of Marxist ideal of pulling people together and collective farms and all that. And he's talking about the tremendous alcoholism. This is a person telling me about what he saw in Prague, and the alcoholism and so many bars, people sitting around and just drinking in isolation, and seeing people not cared for in that setting also.
Even on the psychological or therapeutic level, I can't think of the author's name. He spoke in Toledo recently, The Road Less Traveled.
Yes, Scott Peck.
Scott Peck. Kind of a pop approach to solidarity, just as a sake, from the therapeutic point of view. And in his last book, Communities for Peace, he says this is not just a therapy. If it is therapeutic, it's because we're in closer touch with what human nature is all about anyway. It is about communities.
So what we find, Jim, is in this privatism is that people begin to think of themselves in private terms. I think Metz, the theologian we're talking about here, Johann Baptist Metz, talks about the ant mentality. I'm not sure exactly how that fits into this. I tend to think of that sort of computerized mentality where people begin to think of themselves on the model of a sophisticated machine. And as soon as we think about ourselves in that as functionaries only and on a machine model, then I think we have some sort of difficulties that arise, because then it's hard to see how we're going to bond together. You don't bond machines together. I suppose you do. You bond computers, but it doesn't have the warmth and care that we usually think about in close bonding.
Even some of the religious experiences of the church, we grew up rather traditional spiritualities with the focus on the sufferings of Christ during Lent. And I was never much into graphics, but certainly it was not morbid, but nevertheless a heavy stress on the sufferings of Christ. And then somehow at Easter time rejoicing that all the morbid season's over with, change the colors in the church, light the candles. But if you stress, say, Latin America today, the processions of candles, or the mothers of the disappeared standing on street corners, you understand, aha, this is what the Church has been trying to do all along, preserve the sense of prayerfulness together. There is suffering. We are bonded even in tears. We are a expectant people, which I think is one of Metz's themes, the imminence of the coming of Christ, and not in the sense of we're looking at our watches now saying we'll be taken up to heaven, raptured away tomorrow, but the sense of living that sense of expectation of the kingdom.
You know, Jim, I was thinking that Metz gives us this analysis that in the privatized culture, because you have the rise of science, that science gives you a sense where we can dominate things, we can control, we can work experiments to figure out what to do, and then we can set up technology, and we can bend nature to our own will, and so on. And what Metz thinks is that that becomes a part of our mode of interacting with one another. So that instead of operating on the basis of solidarity and a sense of community, that we get a dominating mode prevalent in human relationships. That's again, once you begin to think about yourself that way, then you don't see yourself as a social being, but as a private being who then has all of these various relationships that one must juggle and maintain and somehow control to one's own end.
He's doing a very delicate balancing act in that, though. I understand what you're saying, but without technology, you know, I can't. Quintessante, that film with Philip Glass music in the background, showing the technology of Earth being torn up and so forth, very depressing, nihilistic.
I don't know the film, but
it's one of the art films out recently. But as you watch the Earth being torn up to make place for the deforestation of South America, for instance, and you see the pollutants in Los Angeles, you see the expressway systems in New York City, and it all becomes dehumanized. Yet without technology, I don't know how we reach anybody. But the point Metz makes, which is he's a good social critic for that, but the point comes up, though, that when we use technology to distance ourselves from people, you create more of an alienated society. I think the city of Detroit, I hope not condemned for broadcasting this, the city of Detroit is a marvelous example of the alienation of anybody in that city. To go, you know, how highways are meant for communication. Highways in Detroit mercifully take people around the city or over the city, away from the city, so you don't have to even see city life. You don't have to be scandalized by seeing the poverty there. The city is hollow from within. The irony is, the paradox, which would be good for T.S. Eliot to work with if he were alive today, is why the highway itself, a symbol of communication in Detroit, mercifully relieves people from social contact.
What you're trying to do is, of course, get a more balanced view of technology so that we don't think that technology is the only thing that's causing privatism here. No. In other words, we can't overcome our problems today by pretending that we didn't have an industrial revolution or that science doesn't influence our lives or that computers won't be an ongoing part of the human scene. So what we have to do is find a way to humanize with technology. And I think Metz is just showing us, I think, the dark side of technology and how it can separate us rather than bring us together.
I think our cities, take the privatism, go to a theater today, if anyone breathes too loud or wrinkles their popcorn bag too loud, you give them a dirty look. You tell them, shh, quiet. You go to Europe, and they are telling the opera singer whether she can sing or not. Move it along because we have to get on, we want the other person to come in there. You go to St. Peter's in Rome, and they're screaming at each other, standing on statues, talking to the Pope while he's giving his address, which they're really not listening to. They like to be out with other people. For us, in the United States, the church is a place we don't talk to anybody. You keep very quiet. Again, in Rome, you get that big, wonderful, warm embrasio from somebody who meets you in church, a big hug, a bear hug and a kiss. And here, at the sign of peace, where you're supposed to embrace your neighbor, everybody gives a stingy little nod. I said, no one's ever going to lose their virginity during the sign of peace. But in Rome, it was a big, warm embrace. Likewise, too, in Europe, the streets are meant for people to be out with each other, enjoy the sidewalk cafe life. It's so communal. Here, if you have to go outside, you hop in the car and roll up your windows. It's a strange experience.
Metz points out as well, Jim, that this privatism comes to play even in our sort of humanistic psychology, which moves us towards personal growth in relationships. We talk a lot about encounter and somehow coming closer to other people and so on. And Metz sees that again as simply a way of avoiding the larger social questions. It's akin to the analysis Robert Bella gives us in Habits of the Heart, where he says that we have not only a utilitarian individualism where people are trying to get ahead and make money and move through the corporate structure and so on, but there's also what he calls an expressive individualism where people are involved in the very private enterprise of developing their talents and so that they can sort of meet people and enjoy the fruits of relationship but not do it with any kind of depth. That's an interesting kind of analysis to me as well. And then there's the other thing he says about the question of how well middle-class people can relate to those who are poorer. He says, or those who are of a certain different social strata. He says it's hard for us to interconnect with them. I mean, if we have, a decent way of living and, can you really visit somebody's home who, is living below the poverty line? Can you feel comfortable there? Can they feel comfortable coming to your home? How do you end up interacting? And so he says where money and status become the what we really are, that's what we treasure, in that kind of situation you cannot have solidarity with people who are either much higher on the social scale than you are or much lower. And that, again, I think that plays out. We'd have to ask ourselves, as middle-class people, do we have the same sort of affinity, human openness to people who are down and out as we do with people who are well-to-do? I think the church people have to ask themselves that question.
I don't know if he has an understanding of the American experience on that. The principle is a good one. I think our idea of middle class in the United States is a lot broader than it might be in Europe. It's not uncommon, say, in a parish to find one who is a mildly skilled laborer also being on a committee, at a school board committee, with one who might be a minor executive. Professionally, they're quite far apart, but they have found that community, say the school community, it's an easy one to point to, bereavement committees, things like that, where they do interact, and a lot of socialization does take place at a level like that. That becomes one. We'll talk about that in a later program, I think, one of the functions of the church to start making those bridges take place. I do not think that we find, I'm talking from middle class experience, admittedly. Right. That absolute kind of alienation. Where we find the alienation is, for instance, if someone here in the city of Toledo has had their house firebombed because of drugs or something like that, we have no idea really how to get in there and work with them from our point of view, understanding what their pain is. It would be so much easier to say either stay away from me or here's a lump sum. There is the alienation that exists there.
Yeah, but your point is well taken, Jim, and that is that you always have to be careful with these European theologians when they talk about societal analysis, whether it really fits here in the United States. And I think our reality is different. We have such a large middle class, and we have interactions in ways maybe that they're not familiar with in Europe. And I think you said that well. I mean, there's a lot of times that blue-collar workers and white-collar workers can work very well on something. They might coach a little league team together, and or the wives are connected with the Red Cross or something. Or the people play bridge together. I mean, I think that happens, and so it does cross certain barriers. But on the other hand, the analysis that what really creates relationships is sort of money, and that you tend to be at ease with those people that are the socioeconomic class, I think is true. I mean, you can see it in people who belong to clubs together. And I think you see it at the other end of the scale among the sort of solidarity, at least as outsiders, we see among the poor and the minority groups. I mean, very often it does seem to us as an observer that they have found ways to bond and to hold one another and to be with one another in very difficult situations.
I've been in some of the very low subsidized housing here in the city, and I said, "Do you have a refrigerator?" He says, "No, but don't worry, we do." and you know very well that they are pooling their resources wherever they can, and that kind of solidarity is one of these things, a typical phrase of liberation theology: the poor have something to teach us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And specifically on this question of how we understand ourselves. So let's take us now. Metz suggests that if we're going to overcome privatism that keeps us isolated and estranged and move into a healthier kind of communal living, that we need a different self-understanding. He talks about an anthropological revolution. What that means is he wants us to begin to see ourselves in root and in essence as social creatures, that we're already interdependent, that we can't make it alone, that this idea of picking yourself up by your own bootstraps can never be a final answer, that we are dependent upon parents as we grow up, we're dependent upon the society in which we live, we get our values from the culture, we've got institutions like the church and so on that are meant to help us to know who we are. So he wants us to learn to live in solidarity with the living and the dead, as he says, to have a sense that we are not isolated either from people who lived a long time ago or from future generations, but that we are interdependent creatures. That becomes one of his rallying cries. He thinks we have to change, be converted in our thinking and in our feeling in order to make progress in the world.
I like the phrase there, reconverted in our thinking. There is no revolution without repentance. I just love that. The conversion constantly in society. One cannot simply... Once one does not have examined where do I stand with others, we atrophy. I don't know how that takes place. I would be very reluctant to think it happens only in times of crisis. It might be headed in that way for us. I don't know. In Latin America, it did. But Europe itself went through crisis, and I don't know if they have found the same experience as they did in Latin America.
One of the things that Metz criticizes about his teacher, Karl Rahner, and Metz is the greatest disciple of Rahner, and although he's gone off in his own directions, and he's associated with what we call political theology, but he claimed that when Rahner looked at human existence, he saw us as people, as individuals who are questing for more knowledge and searching for more love and experience, and he criticized his own teacher, Karl Rahner, for being too privatized in his viewpoint. He says, not everyone searches for love and knowledge in the same ways. We are controlled by our political and economic and cultural milieu, that people in Ethiopia are not asking the same questions of meaning as we would have here in the United States. I mean, they're trying to figure out how to stay alive.
It's funny. One of the last books published on Rahner was his book of memoirs, I Remember. And I thought, at last, now we'll find out how he felt about the war. I mean, I've got 3 bookshelves filled with his books, nothing at all about the politics of Germany. And he covers it in about 2 pages and says, I don't know how I would talk about that now. It was a different world then. And he really didn't care to talk about that.
You know, Metz criticizes him. He says Rahner maintained silence on Auschwitz. Yeah. That Rahner never did an extended analysis of Auschwitz, how it could happen in a Christian country, in a civilized world, and that's one of Metz's great criticisms. He says you cannot do that. You can't just talk about people searching for happiness. You must root them in the political and economic times in which they live. And so he wants us to see ourselves right away that way, as influenced by our culture, so that as I begin to ask questions, I do so as a middle-class male who has not known the kind of oppression that minorities know, who's always had enough to eat, doesn't know what it means to be scrounging for food to stay alive. I have to know that about myself if I'm going to come to an authentic self-understanding. I think Metz has a good point here. Mm-hmm. The anthropological revolution will move us to ask ourselves, who are we in context? And then that reveals things about us. I was talking to a woman recently who noticed something at a meeting about the fact that the way the chairs were arranged was not very dialogic or inviting for participation. And I said, I never noticed it. I mean, it never came to my mind. And I thought, well, the reason she noticed that is because she is a woman and has been often excluded from the conversation. So when she gets in that setting, she has this sense, boy, this is exclusionary. I mean, I want to be a participant. That would be an example, it seems to me, of how we could understand ourselves in greater depth by moving in the direction Metz wants us to.
Although I guess I am personally frightened at times when someone assigns himself the role of being a social change agent. I would personally like to reflect on it, feel warm about it, and then go ahead and do that. It's just my reflective style. And I don't know what removes the blindness. Some people say you don't have to know, we're going to do it this way. And that's when people have that natural fear of, especially middle-class people, with good common wisdom for the middle Americas, say we don't want anybody to tell us. We have to bust. We need class action, sort of thing. And people get a little bit afraid when they say a social agent will intrude and bring this about. Ironically, in Latin America, it did not happen by intrusion. They found a common need and a common healing
in the base communities and
mm-hmm.
so on.
Yeah.
I think it's important to link Metz's social anthropology, his understanding of us as rooted in institutions and culture, in the scriptures. I think there's a much more social notion of human existence there. So the human beings in the Hebrew scriptures are saved not as individuals, but because they're a member of the people, the chosen people. And for Jesus, people are not just isolated souls he's going to save. They are embodied creatures and spirited bodies that he brings into the community. You're going to be saved by joining up, in a sense, by following, becoming disciples with others. So there's a social anthropology right in the scriptures.
Which is very antithetical to American religion. In fact, street preachers are not common anymore in this part of the country. But I remember as a kid hearing them downtown shouting out, "You won't be saved by joining the church. Do you have a personal belief on Jesus Christ?" And I thought, well, gee, I don't want to jeopardize my love for our Lord Jesus Christ. At the same time, I said, no, I'm a member of the church. The Catholics don't have that much of a problem with it. It's not a dichotomy for them. But at the same privatism, the church will not carry you. The whole notion of a holy people of God is foreign to even privatist religious experience.
Yes. So Metz's point is a real return to the scriptures is going to give us a different sense of freedom, that we really become free in solidarity with others, in community and not in isolation. It's going to give us a sense that we must walk the path following Christ together and holding each other as we do so. Jim, you have a quick comment because we're running out of time.
The notion even of going into the promised land with the pact or the covenant, do not steal your neighbor's property, but live in such a way you don't even want to. That sense of solidarity. As they would meet these Canaanites, whom they would welcome into the community, receive into the community, and they would swear to the covenant. That bonding is marvelous. I bind myself to this kind of people.
So, Jim, we've been talking about Johann Baptist Metz, a great German theologian, disciple of Rahner, still alive and making his contribution. And he calls us to understand ourselves not as private individuals seeking gain or dominating people, but as social creatures who are called to live in solidarity with others.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Father James Cryan, who is pastor of St. Pius X Catholic Church in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was privatism in our culture, insight from relationships. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.